Good evening, Nina Mairata with SBS World News Australia. The federal government's advisor on climate change has described it as a diabolical policy problem and the toughest faced by any Australian government. But he says drastic action is needed and has backed the government's proposed 2010 starting date for an emissions trading scheme. And he's warned that the biggest losers will be the nation's low-income households.
He started light-hearted with alternative titles.
The winner by acclamation was No Pain, No Rain.
It stays as draft report. The 600 pages are no joke.
Climate change is a diabolical policy problem. It is harder than any other issue of high importance that has come before our polity in living memory.
Professor Ross Garnaut's proposing an emissions trading scheme beginning in 2010. He recommends a 2-year transition. Transport and petrol should be in, agriculture should be out, and permits for polluters should be sold, not given away. The Prime Minister commissioned the review. Now he calls it just one input to policy. How does Professor Garnaut feel about that?
I'm just one input into the Prime Minister's thinking, and he's just one input into mine. This is an independent report.
He warns against interference, but sympathises with the impact on industry and householders. He says permit profits should be distributed, 20% to research low emissions technology, the rest in compensation, 30% to hard-hit high-polluting export industries, 50% to low-income households facing rising prices.
Could be through tax cuts, it could be through social security adjustment.
No specific commitments yet.
It is in our national interest to act, it is in our economic interest to act, and it is in the interests of our children and grandchildren for this generation to act.
Some have concerns.
The major factor being hoped for here is clean coal. That's fool's coal.
It's also extremely important for Australia and Australians that we go into the new world of climate change with our economic eyes wide open.
He favours cutting petrol excise. Professor Garnaut doesn't.
Simultaneously reducing excise, then you would send some funny sort of signal.
The opposition also says it's starting too soon.
Now is not the best time to start. That best time was years ago, and there were proposals before the Australian Cabinet years ago.
The report says inaction will cost $400 billion annually and kill the Great Barrier Reef and Murray-Darling River. Despite government efforts, Ross Garnaut says the river could die anyway. Professor Garnaut hasn't yet set emissions reduction targets or a carbon price. He says other prices will rise but can't confirm how much. He'll finalise those estimates once he sees Treasury's economic modelling. Karen Middleton, World News Australia.
Environmentalists, business groups and unions have welcomed the broad thrust of the Garnaut report, but some conservationists argue that he should have pushed for stronger action to combat climate change, while industry has called for compensation to help meet the costs of an emissions trading scheme.
Environment groups say while Professor Garnaut's identified the scale of the problem, he should have recommended a more urgent response.
If we want a really good chance of handing on a healthy Great Barrier Reef to our kids and avoiding devastating droughts, we need to go further and we need to go much faster.
And they argue he's placed too much faith in what's called clean coal technology.
He has too much emphasis on the notion of clean coal, which will not be ready for at least 2 decades, and we need to take very strong action on a much quicker time frame than that.
An emissions trading scheme presents both opportunities and extra costs for business. In many cases, those costs will be passed on to consumers. A recommendation to compensate low-income earners has been warmly welcomed.
It seems that they are committed to equity in the distribution of funds from the emissions trading scheme.
But some companies which export their products won't be able to pass on rising costs.
This is why it's very important to have adequate compensation for trade-exposed emissions-intensive businesses. So we need to recognise that we're creating an unlevel playing field.
Heavy emitters, including the coal-fired power industry, will be among those paying the highest price. But the union representing mine workers isn't worried.
The scare campaign about power workers losing their jobs run by power generation companies is just a nonsense. There will be no jobs lost as a result of the implementation of this report.
Energy suppliers argue they should be compensated, but the ACTU says the trading scheme must be as broad as possible.
Everybody must be involved. People will be looked after where they are seriously vulnerable, but special pleading, getting out of jail free, it's not on the agenda.
Some believe Ross Garnaut's agenda should have included a greater emphasis on stopping logging.
If we are to meet those dramatic reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, we will have to look at the role of nature in solving the problem, particularly the role of Australia's forests.
They say natural remedies shouldn't be forgotten in the debate over an emissions trading scheme. Richard Davis, World News, Australia.
Former hostage Ingrid